Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I would like to talk about Hidden True Crimes, Dr. John, Dr. Babe. Um, this is the husband, John Matthias, husband of Lauren Matthias from HTC. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the meltdown. Okay, this was basically where John just kind of went off and just lost his temper and I'm sorry, he bitched out, just started bitching out Lori Hellis, a former collaborator, kind of bringing up stuff that had happened like years ago, where apparently she had cut him off when he was right about to give. He said his best answer because he was getting emotional and because he was getting vulnerable. Okay, and without actually reading her mind, he just asserts without knowledge. He asserts what was in her mind and the reason why she supposedly cut him off. Okay, now, we all know that may be the reason why she cut him off, but maybe there were other reasons why she cut him off. It may have just been she's just in her own head. Okay, but he developed this whole fantasy of why she didn't want him to speak, and apparently he's still very upset about it. Okay, now before I go any further, I did get one feedback. Okay, at least one person in the comments let me know, and I defer to them that probably John's rage, like the level of that rage, wasn't really because of what happened 3 years ago. That he's probably kind of transferring his rage in the present because Lori Hellis is sort of siding with Christina right now. Okay. And so that's what got him so upset. And so he's kind of transferring that back to the past. But I guess I would just say that, I think he is probably pretty upset about what happened in the past. Um, in any case, the point of this video is just kind of like what can we how can we analyze Dr. John? And I let's just be really careful. I don't think it's a very good karma to make people specimens. Okay, I know Dr. John has a habit of turning people into specimens. We need to be careful not to make a specimen of a person. Okay, so a lot of people criticize me because I'm too nice and I'm too forgiving or whatever. No, it's kind of like respect for the road. If you're driving a car, you need to respect the road. Okay, if you're flying an airplane, you need to respect the weather. Okay, in other words, if you're looking at somebody like Lori Vallow or some criminal, Charles Manson, whatever, you have to have respect for them, not because you like them, but just respect for them as people. Because if you don't respect something, you can't really analyze it. Okay, you don't analyze it properly, and I think it's kind of bad karma not to have respect for anything. If I see a wasp or a rattlesnake in my backyard, I have to look at it with respect. You know what I mean? I just think that's a good policy. So with respect. Okay, John being one of our brothers, one of our goofball humans. Let's take a look with respect and not make him a specimen, but just kind of look into ourselves and what can we see. You know what I mean? So, in that regard, my first impression of Dr. John, especially when I see him right next to his wife, okay, my first impression is kind of comical. Okay, now, a lot of people would say being comical is not having respect. Okay, but I would think, think of like brothers and sisters, think of like cousins, when we're growing up. You kind of make fun of each other. That is part of the endearing affection that we have with people, to be playful and to see sometimes people sort of in a comic light. There are different levels of making fun of somebody. You can make fun of someone in a dehumanizing way where you don't regard them with any respect, but thinking of them as like our weird cousins, let's say. I did have a comical reaction to seeing them on camera, and this is not the first time I felt this way, but they kind of gave me a televangelist husband and wife vibe. Okay, kind of like I sort of saw like Paula White. I don't know why, but I thought that sometimes it seems like Lauren is sort of like channeling Mika Brzezinski, from like that show she does with her husband. I forget their names. Mika Brzezinski. And then sometimes she seems like Paula White, and I just saw like in my soul, I just saw the souls of two televangelists kind of defending themselves together, and they sort of had the harmony that you would get out of a televangelist couple, so I thought kind of adds a little meaning to the hyper religiosity that I was suggesting the last time. But in any case, so yeah, that was my first impression, was just kind of like a couple of televangelists defending themselves, and also kind of self-promoting, just this heavy compulsive just onslaught of self-promotion. Just felt a lot like what you would see from a couple of televangelists, you know. The other thing that came to mind, I don't know why, but I just came into my mind. Has anybody seen the Christopher Guest movies? Okay, when I say Christopher Guest, like think Best in Show, think Waiting for Guffman, A Mighty Wind. Okay, those movies. Look them up if you haven't seen them. Now, it's not like I've seen any couple that's exactly like John and Lauren in those movies, but I'm thinking they would fit so well in one of those movies. You know, if Christopher Guest was still making mockumentaries, I think he might want to make a movie with that with John and Lauren. I think they could make a lot of money. I mean, because they are really funny, and I do think they have kind of an it factor for some kind of comic value. And I do think the comic value comes from their being so confident in taking ridiculous positions. Okay. And we've seen that device in comedy where, you know, people take these really ridiculous positions and their extra confidence makes them seem ridiculous, you know, ridiculous, you know, like our cousins can be ridiculous, you know. So anyway, that was my first impression. And before getting into the actual meltdown incident, okay, before he actually lost his temper, I kind of thought to myself, you know, I have a theory, like I've said before, you know, I think when people are couples in a relationship, they may not have the same issues, but their issues sort of fit together, you know. So if one of them has like some kind of weird issue, the other one probably has similar, maybe not the same, you know. But I thought to myself, you know, I don't know if John really has all of the issues that Lauren has. I mean, he probably has some complementary issues. I think in many respects, I think John kind of feeds Lauren's problems. He kind of helps. He kind of enables her issues, or sort of feeds her paranoia, kind of stuff. Um, so I can see that. And also, when Lauren has conflicts, he might feed her side of the conflict to sort of keep her in the conflict. You know, so he kind of has this weird enabling thing, not unlike the spouses of really fat, I'm sorry, really overweight people, really obese people, where they get into this weird codependency where one of the partners kind of feeds the other one literally, and they call them feeders. You know, it's kind of like the extreme version of, you know, someone who kind of feeds the other person's weaknesses or their, you know, like say imagine like some woman who's a drug addict and she's like together with a drug dealer who kind of feeds her addiction because that's a way of keeping her in the house. Kind of something really weird, kind of basic and primal, but that kind of, I would say, kind of codependent streak, you know. Anyway, so when I was thinking of John, you know, I was thinking, would it be fair to even consider, like, say, a personality disorder? And I would say there's just too many more basic things to rule out, you know. I mean, yeah, he does seem a little bit arrogant. He does seem to be extremely grandiose, real grandiose. He even has a little bit of vanity, you know, because he likes to compare himself, however indirectly, but he likes to always associate himself with celebrities. You know what I mean? So I mean, yeah, you could see the pattern. But do I see a full blown narcissistic personality disorder? I just think there's too many other things to rule out. You know, I think he's got a lot of codependency. I think he's got a lot of insecurity, big time, and I think he's had a lot of social issues and just a glaring immaturity. But I think the main reason why I would not want to even really put on the table, like say a personality disorder, is I get the feeling that John has been kind of indoctrinated. And in that way, he's a lot like Lauren, because Lauren was raised in a, you know, in a household and a culture of heavy indoctrination. And I think in that sense, John is similar because, at least in his world of psychology, I think he comes across as being extremely devout, but his devoutness in psychology kind of comes across as like being extremely heavily indoctrinated. Okay, and my guess is that because of his own self-esteem issues and trying to seek to be a great person, you know, I'm sure after college he just wanted to be a great person. He kind of delivered himself into psychology, it looks like, kind of as a sort of salvation, because maybe he didn't feel good as a person, or he was very empty, or he felt very inept socially. And so I get the feeling of somebody who just religiously kind of delivered themselves into psychology and kind of gave his soul. You know, he traded his original soul for an indoctrinated soul. And so that's all you really see from him, is just this very indoctrinated kind of intellectual sort of persona. So when I see that level of indoctrination, I'm thinking more brainwashing. You know, I mean, brainwashing is a rude way to say it. A more polite way to say it is just heavily indoctrinated. So, before taking this any deeper with regard to Dr. John, we can sort of go back and sort of look at John and Lauren together and say that these are two people who are both, one way or the other, they're both very indoctrinated. And they both have sort of manufactured, or they've ended up with kind of manufactured sort of constructs of their own personalities that are really sort of idealized personalities. Okay, so they're heavily indoctrinated. They portray an idealized personality, but they carry, both of them, sort of toxic baggage that they don't really own as their own because they're so heavily invested in their ideal personalities. Okay, and I think one of the most telling symptoms that a person is heavily indoctrinated, okay, a telling symptom is when a person has an implausible accent. An implausible accent. Okay. Now, John, a lot of times has a what I would consider to be a Chicago accent. Okay, I can hear that, and I can hear sort of like the tone of his voice. It sounds at times more masculine, at times less masculine. But what I'm really listening to is the affectation. Okay. And sometimes John gets into an affectation of something that almost resembles a homosexual way of speaking. Okay. Now, those of us who are actually homosexual, that is, it is an affectation, but that really is part of a belonging in a real culture. Okay. In John's case, it's really an affectation. Okay. He's not gay. I know he's not. I don't think he is at all. But I think he's getting into the affectation of a kind of homosexual sounding tone of voice, because I think that's his credentials for belonging to what I think is probably, I mean, let's say Democrat. He said in the video that when he went to Trader Joe's, he went with a mask. Oh, and he has a reason. He has a reason. Okay, I'm sure he has post COVID, long COVID. I mean, look, there is something that correlates to political affiliation. Okay, and a heavy left wing American Democrat affiliation is very sanguine. It's very, very compatible with idealizing psychology. Okay. Having a devout, sort of a devout relationship with psychology, I think that's very, very fitting with somebody who's very ideologically oriented in his politics. Okay. So I think that one of the best passports or credentials to be a member, a good, believable member of the American left wing, is to kind of have a little bit slightly more homosexual sounding voice. Or if you might say, I think the way they would describe it is they're trying to sound a little bit feminist, a little bit feminist. Okay. And so that's all kind of a picture. Now, no criticism, okay, because some of us have affectations. Okay. I'm not trying to criticize them, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's a sign. It's a sign of somebody who's heavily indoctrinated and who likes to carry their credentials. And the credentials are often in the form of the idealized personality that they sort of portray. You see what I mean? So he's carrying, I would say, devout credentials. Okay, and that is a parallel to what we described yesterday or the last video as the keep sweet voice that Lauren uses as her credential. And just as is the case with Lauren, okay, whereas, Lauren in her idealized keep sweet personality, just like she cannot own, like, say, the darker, more Machiavellian parts of herself, in the very same way, John, with this kind of sissy boy, sissy way of talking, this kind of Democrat way of talking, he's kind of in a way telling everybody, I'm not aggressive. Okay, I'm too feminist to be an aggressive thug like those right wing, like all those what do they call them, those fascists on the other side. I'm not a fascist. I'm not one of those thug wife beating hulking dudes. And but that's what he thinks, and that's what he's portraying. That's not the truth. That's what he's portraying. You see, you always have to distinguish between the truth and what people are asserting. He's asserting something with his persona, not necessarily the truth. Okay, and I think we saw in the blow up that he can blow up just like any dude, like any guy. But there's a difference. Okay, yeah, I know guys, I've seen guys blow up like that, but in my experience, what you're dealing with is not a guy, you're dealing with an immature guy. Immature. Okay, the way he blew up. Okay, but I think this blow up tells us a lot because John had the good. I guess he was gracious enough to give us some information in his blow up. Okay, he gave us information. He told us that this was all about his vulnerability, which he asserted with pride, pride, pride in his vulnerability, feminist pride. That darn it, I'm vulnerable and people don't respect me. People can't handle it, like this feminized ideal. And he was mad. He was really mad. But at least we can see that he believed there was something very high and righteous about his what he calls vulnerability. Okay, which is a portrayal. It doesn't mean that's the truth of what he is. Okay. The other thing that I think everybody noticed, okay, well, and also I think John probably regrets that he said this. I think John, if he goes back, I think he's kind of embarrassed that he did this. But he actually, in his, as he was like letting off all this steam and just having his meltdown, he let escape something that I think he didn't really want to say publicly, which was that he felt that was going to be one of his best answers. That if Lori Hellis hadn't cut him off in this podcast 3 years ago, he was getting emotional, getting vulnerable, and it was going to be one of his best. I'm sorry, best performances, I think is what he wanted to say. you know, and so you get the idea of someone who sort of treasures his best. He sort of has a treasuring he has kind of a treasuring sort of aspect, where he sort of treasures his best things. As that could have been a trophy for him. And I think that makes sense because when you see him holding his books, he holds his books like treasures. They're like treasured possessions. And I thought to myself, that's interesting because I think that both Lauren and John kind of have this sort of treasuring possession of things. Like say look at how Lauren had to do such scheming and such intelligence to sort of like to trick Nate Eaton and to say the right things to get a copy of Lori Hellis's book. Okay, isn't that kind of like really a craving to possess something? You know, she said in the Mormon Stories podcast that she was craving getting a sealing in the temple, like being sealed to John in the temple. She was craving it. It's like, I want to possess that. And I see John possessing his books, just possessing. And I thought, that's interesting, a lot of possessing. And then I also noticed, that they seem so eager to possess Colby Ryan as theirs. Colby Ryan, John even said out loud, very inappropriately, because it put Colby on the spot. Thank God Colby is such a healthy young guy. He could kind of let it roll off his back. But it was so inappropriate to put him on the spot by telling him live while they were broadcasting, on YouTube, to say that, I'd like to have you as a son in so many words. I'm sure that he didn't say it exactly like that, but he really wanted to adopt Colby as his son. That's the desire to possess, you see. And so when I see that, that is to me something that seems to be common to both Lauren and John. And when you have kind of an immature level of coveting of possessions and a very kind of I don't know, this kind of fixation on possessing things, it's kind of, if it's that marked in your personality, that to me is a sign of just immaturity. You're kind of stuck at a very like a toddler level of relationship with objects, you know. And so, before I start throwing around the concepts of like personality disorder, I'm looking at two people that seem really immature, at least in that sense. They're very mature in other ways, but they have these little aspects of immaturity, like around possessing things. But I think my most serious observation of John is really has to do with something that he maybe doesn't say outright. Okay, sometimes the things you don't say outright are actually the most important things. Okay. And I think what I'm seeing in John, in his indoctrinated persona, his indoctrinated kind of feminist psychologist persona, okay, I think I'm seeing something around a very controversial concept, okay, something that's very politically controversial at this time, very politically divisive. And this is the concept of salvation in empathy. Okay. In other words, empathy. I mean, empathy, empathy, I'm not saying it's not important. Empathy is like sugar, sugar is important. Do I want to make sugar my only God, my only salvation? I mean, sugar is just, if you have too much of it, you get sick. If you don't have enough, you get sick. I mean, what is the big deal with empathy? Empathy is like an element, it's like something, it's like one of many ingredients, you know what I mean? But somehow I find that psychology has a fixation with empathy. Okay. Now, granted, I know that some people have more empathy than others. I understand that. But it's still just one element. You know what I mean? And so I think there's something ideological and political around that. And I think potentially dangerous. Dangerous. Okay. And I think John is an example because I think John, in the end, however much empathy he has, he's shown himself not to really have, I would say, social interpersonal competence. He doesn't govern himself, and he doesn't really have, I don't think, a very gracious relationship with other people. Okay, so however much empathy he hasn't achieved the Superman status, because I think people who consider themselves empathic in nowadays, in today's environment, if you have empathy, it's like, my God, I have everything. That's my passport to every goodness, every success in the world. Well, is it really? I think John may have loads of empathy, but I think he has a breakdown in his ability to interact interpersonally, and I think even to govern himself. Okay, so what can we learn from that? Because I think we need to learn something from that, and I do think that psychology gives us so many mixed signals because I think there's so much political interest in psychology. Okay, so let's talk about this very seriously. First, let's start with a confession. Let's confess, okay? Psychology has achieved a certain status as part of our religious indoctrination as people. Okay, what do I mean by religious indoctrination? Religious indoctrination, whatever you may believe personally, it's kind of the way we recite our allegiance, our pledge of allegiance. What is the pledge of allegiance to Christianity? You know, and he died and he was buried, and on the third day he rose. We say that with an incantation, like it's not ABCD, it's ABCDE. Yet you say with an incantation, he died, and on the third day he rose. You say it with a way of speaking. It's not regular speaking. It's a declaration of allegiance, religious allegiance. Okay, in the very same way with empathy, we know from our indoctrination, we don't even have to check Wikipedia, we just know, if you don't have empathy, you're a psychopath. If you don't have empathy, you're a narcissist. If you don't have empathy, you can't have a conscience. Okay, wait a minute. That is what we're indoctrinated to think, but that is a very, very imprecise and unscientific way to break things down. Okay, let's be honest with ourselves. Okay, empathy is one aspect of the way we relate to other people, the way we sense other people. Okay, but there are other ways we sense other people, and they already have an answer for that. Psychology has a prepackaged rebuttal to that, where they say, "Oh yes, yes, psychopaths are very good at understanding people without feeling what they feel. So they have pseudo empathy, or they have cognitive empathy, and so the psychopath is very good at knowing what you're feeling." And okay, yeah, that is true. That is true. Of course, it's true. But what is the real message they're trying to get away from? They're trying to get into us is that only empathy. If you don't have empathy, then you must have a fake empathy. You must have a counterfeit empathy. You don't really have a conscience. You're not really part of the good people. That's religious. That's religious. Okay. I'm sorry. It is religious. Okay. Because let's go into the reality. Okay. And of course, let's be honest. Okay. A psychopath does have a way of feeling other people. Okay. So let's admit that. That is true. But we don't have to get to the full conclusion that they get to. Okay. And it is also true that if you don't have empathy, you may have issues. I mean, you may or may not, but let's really break it down. Okay, let's really break it down. First of all, what I think psychology is doing is they're trying to create a taboo. They're trying to create a taboo around different ways that we sense each other, okay, that are not emotional, okay? Because empathy is emotional sensing. It's emotional sensing, okay? And they're trying to make a taboo around other kinds of sensing that are not emotional. What about intuitive sensing? Intuitive sensing, okay? What about cognitive sensing? Okay, like Mr. Spock, whatever. Okay, they're just parts of us. I mean, yeah, you don't want to be 100% Mr. Spock. I get that. If you're 100% Mr. Spock, you're weird. I get that. Okay. You don't want to be 100% intuitive. I mean, that's kind of creepy, right? But there is, let's say, cognitive sensing, there's intuitive sensing, maybe there's even spiritual sensing. You know what I mean? When I say spiritual, I'm not talking about supernatural. I'm just saying different wavelengths of how we relate to each other. Also, when they talk about empathic sensing, like emotional sensing, what level of emotion are they talking about? Okay, I wonder, because I think when I see psychologists, I see a fussy level of emotion, kind of like, oh, let's go back to being infants. Those are the innocent ones. Okay, the problem is that infants have infantile emotions. Okay, and I think sometimes when we see psychologists like modeling their emotions to us, like Dr. John, and he's not the only one, I've seen other psychologists, um, you see them modeling what I would call kind of maudlin emotions. Maudlin, Maudlin, maudlin emotions, kind of like sissy, like suffering emotions, like really, I don't know, fussing emotions. Okay. What about deep emotion? Okay. What about like still waters run deep? Like the ocean, deep ocean water emotion. Don't we all agree that the real emotions, the deepest emotions in us, are actually so deep they're not really visible. They're kind of below. They're underneath. And I think psychologists, they wanna call that, oh, that's your subconscious and you're not in touch with your real feelings. And it's like, it sounds like a lot of bullshit. I think some of the most profound things in us can sit very deeply in us. Okay, and you can't really control them, like a psychologist can't control them, because they're too deep, and that's part of our deeper soul. So what if we have sensing with people that's not on the surface, like, oh, okay, oh, I'm sorry you felt that way, like performing bullshit. Like, what if it's deeper? Like, okay, you see something happening and you see somebody suffering, and you're like, wow. You don't have tears coming out of your face, but deeply you feel it. You're moved deeply. Okay, I think psychology kind of discounts that. They discount, I think, the full spectrum of emotion. Okay, and they're using the term empathy as like almost like a political cudgel. You know what I mean? To try to guide us through taboo, away from our more intuitive and maybe more spiritual, maybe more cognitive sovereignty. Okay, they don't want us to have sovereignty. They want us just to be emotional herd animals on a very immature level of emotion. Okay, because I really do believe whenever psychologists talk about emotion or model emotion, they always model emotion that to me is not deep emotion. Okay, deep emotion is so deep it's even hard to put into words, and it doesn't go into your face so easy. Okay, the emotions that show up in your face very easy, those are surface emotions. Okay, and so I just think that I'm just seeing problems everywhere. They're not really realistic enough in the full spectrum of emotion, and they seem to put importance in the least important emotions. Okay, the fussing, haggling emotions of a child, those are not the most important emotions. The most important emotions are deeper. Okay, and I'm going to try to explain why I think that psychology has this, I would call it an infantile bias. And I think the reason why religions like to kind of bias us towards being kind of infantile, I think the reason why that's the case is that you can't really have a religion if your members are not dependent on you. You know what I mean? And so to create a dependence, you have to sort of impose like this almost like religious standard that leaves people very limited. you know and I guess it's sort of like the circumcision. You have to sort of castrate yourself to be a member of the tribe. You know what I mean? You have to sort of you have to kind of sacrifice something of yourself to be a member, and the force is in the membership in the tribe. And I just think that psychology comes out of something adjacent to the Marxist movements in the 19th century. Okay, I'm not going to accuse Sigmund Freud of being exactly a Marxist. Okay, but I think he was adjacent, and I think that psychology really caught on with the kind of people that would be very left oriented and very bohemian, maybe. But I think what they were really pushing subconsciously, I think they were really pushing towards kind of minimizing individual sovereignty. Okay, because individual sovereignty kind of sounds a lot like capitalism. Okay, I don't think capitalism means individual sovereignty. That's not what it means to me, but I think that's what they think. I think they think that the enemy, the capitalist enemy, was really heavy into individual sovereignty. So I think subconsciously they kind of do whatever they can to kind of destroy or mount an attack on individual sovereignty. So, they're going to find like the highest virtues in the most unhelpful, immature range of emotion. And then when they focus on the healthiness of having good sensing of other people, they're going to focus on the range of, let's say, the frequency range in our interpersonal sensing that focuses on the least healthy emotions, and really cabins us into that emotional place, and doesn't really approve of us expanding beyond that. You see what I mean? So I'm not talking about, oh, good for the psychopath, he has another way of relating. No, not that, because those people are sick. Those people are sick. I'm talking about healthy people, or people that want to be healthy to expand their sense of other people, not just to be in the unhealthy emotional range. I would encourage people to look for the depth emotions, the emotions that you can't perform, the emotions that don't get into your face, the ones that get into your gut, the gut punch. When you get punched in the gut by something, it doesn't necessarily show on your face. It's just, it gets you deep, and it may take weeks or months or even years to digest that. You know what I mean? No psychologist can get into your guts. They'll mess with your head. You know what I mean? And so I think the biggest parts of our soul are kind of like deeply in us, and I think that I wouldn't trust a religion that kind of doesn't, that emphasizes too much, like, say, a more unhealthy, frivolous dimension of emotion, you see. So what I'm saying essentially, and this is kind of surprising, what I'm saying here is that in its overemphasis of infantile child emotion, in a way, psychology kind of puts a taboo, and it kind of distracts us from real emotion, from real, the deep waters emotion, okay, or the deep ocean emotion, okay. And so, in that funny way, as they tout themselves as champions of emotion, psychology is really, in a sense, kind of anti emotion. Okay. They want us to have crappy emotions, they want us to have diaper emotions, and call that a virtue. you know they want to emphasize vulnerability, and this is so interesting. You see, I do believe that people are vulnerable. I do believe that. But when you take the medicine and you take things deep, that makes you strong. It gives you the oak tree, it gives you the oak trunk, and that is not vulnerable. But you have to take the medicine. Take the medicine. Take the medicine, the real medicine, not the stupid psych medicine, but the medicine. That's when you take your frivolous, haggling, fussing emotion, and you let it go down into the depths. You see, down into the deep water. And when you take your medicine, no, you're not, you're going to be less vulnerable. You see, you're going to be stronger, but you're going to be emancipated, and you're going to be sovereign. You see what I mean? And so I think that, in a way, is how I would analyze Dr. John. Okay, when I look at Dr. John's breakdown, I see somebody who's been indoctrinated to have hissy emotion. Okay, hissy facial performance manipulation emotion, child emotion. Okay, he's a guy that doesn't take medicine. He takes maybe medicine for his, maybe for his depression. He takes psych medicine. I don't know. Let me take that back. He may, but he doesn't take real medicine. Medicine is the medicine that only a person can take. No doctor can prescribe this medicine. It's when you take the little frivolous, fussy emotions, and you take it. You see, when somebody is haggling and fussing and sissy sissying, they're haggling to avoid taking their medicine. Okay. So basically, what I would accuse John of, is not his fault. I mean, he's been indoctrinated, but his indoctrination combined with our natural aversion to doing things that are painful. Okay. See, I mean, the keys to the kingdom is pain. That's the beginning of life, the beginning of not being vulnerable, being strong. But I would accuse John of not taking any medicine, because medicine doesn't feel good, and psychology doesn't talk about it, and so it's not in the books. And so he's just learned to do what psychology tells him in the indoctrination, and just find this glory in having really immature, sissy emotions. Okay, and not taking any medicine. And so that's my interpretation of John. He's a guy that hasn't learned to take any medicine. He just hasn't. He's going to fuss over it. Oh my God, I was always so awkward. Nobody liked me. I was lonely. I was depressed. I just feel like a failure. I went to psychology to be a good person, and now I'm a Democrat, and I'm sort of a feminine. I'm a feminist, and where's my salvation? Geez, we have this big YouTube channel, and what these yeah, because you haven't taken any medicine. You know what I mean? You've taken the indoctrination, but you haven't taken any medicine. You know what I mean? And so I would not accuse him of having a personality disorder, but I would just say that he's become over psychologized. He's become hyper religious, overly devout, hyper religious in his psychological left wing Democrat paradigm of all these ideologies and all this left oriented, feminizing, emasculating ideologies, and he has no sovereignty. He proved to us that he has no sovereignty. He may have sovereignty in his belonging to the crowd, his crowd. Okay, he may participate in some kind of power that way, but he doesn't have individual sovereignty. He proved it. And you cannot have deep emotions if you don't take the medicine. In other words, deep emotions don't just come to us. You have to let yourself get punched in the gut, or you have to take things from the throat, from the sissy emotion level, and you have to take it down. It has to go down. You have to take your medicine. And some people just don't. They just haven't learned that, and maybe there's no religion teaching us to do that. But that's pretty much my interpretation of John. I think once he takes his medicine, do never underestimate someone who takes their medicine. Don't ever do that. I don't care who it is. Anybody who starts taking medicine, never underestimate that person. Okay, so John, if he starts taking medicine, I wouldn't even say a word, because you would never be able to predict what he could do. But for now, at least as far as I can tell, this is a guy that doesn't take medicine. Okay, he takes indoctrination, but he doesn't take medicine. He has followed the taboos and the ideals of his religion of left-wing psychology, and it just hasn't occurred to him to take some goddamn medicine. You know what I mean? And that's pretty much my analysis. But once people do take medicine, don't ever underestimate, because that's when people start to be born in the sense of becoming sovereign. You know what I mean? So that's all I have to say about that. Anyway, appreciate your patience, and thanks for watching.